Hello and welcome to our second lecture on Global Asia in a Multipolar World. Today we are really happy to be able to have this conversation with a good colleague and friend, Bryce Beemer, who is Assistant Professor in History at Duke Kunjan University. He has lived, worked, researched in Southeast Asia for many years, primarily in Myanmar and Thailand, and his work ranges widely across the mainland of Southeast Asia and into Northeast India. That is to say, it covers regions that in the 19th and 18th centuries were largely underpopulated, but yet ruled by emerging and waning principalities and kingdoms. His work draws historical comparisons among these traditional kingdoms, focusing especially on the then common practice of slave gathering warfare in order to enslave artisans and other experts. His conclusions shed light on the processes of creolization and cultural exchange, including religious rituals and artistic production. Professor Beemer earned his PhD in Southeast Asian history from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where he studied world history and comparative slavery. His dissertation won the 2014 Dissertation Prize awarded by the World History Association, and essays based on this work have been published among other places in the Historian. His work has been supported by Fulbright Hays, by the Social Science Research Council, and he was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in comparative world history at Corvae College. He served as editor for Trans, a journal devoted to transnational research on the Southeast Asian region, and he lectured extensively at the Smithsonian Institution. I'm really delighted to welcome you here and invite you to present your talk on reimagining the history of slavery in pre-colonial Burma and Southeast Asia. Welcome, Bryce.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Juliana, and thanks for inviting me today. Throughout COVID, I ended up seeing so many lectures online, so many of which had technical difficulties that I've kind of avoided giving one. But now I realize that there's a karmic cycle, and eventually an offer will be so great that you have to jump at it. But the criticism I've had for other online talks now have been visiting me in my own head. So I'm really hoping that this all goes smoothly. So thank you so much. If I asked you all to close your eyes for a minute and summon the image of a slave and slavery, I am fairly sure that most Americans would picture something like this: slave laborers on a cotton plantation in South Carolina. Moreover, I am fairly certain that none of you imagine the kind of slavery that I'm going to discuss today. Southeast Asian artisans and performers captured in the 18th and 19th century warfare, who, while owned by the king that conquered them, retained a certain level of status and prestige in the societies where they were enslaved. This was not an uncommon situation throughout much of the Islamic realm and the Indian Ocean world. It was possible to be owned by someone, so enslaved, but to retain status, respectability, and influence within the society. In 2013, when I completed my dissertation on Southeast Asian slavery and cultural exchange, I quickly learned, after a few spectacular fails, that job talks and invited lectures required a 15-minute introduction defending one specific premise of my research, that slavery even existed in Southeast Asia. It was a necessary defensive strategy because the first question I received in most forums went something like this: but wait, are Southeast Asian slaves real slaves? Can the system you describe authentically be called slavery? It seems so different from what we know about American plantations. And this is a natural question, of course, but it is also more than a hurdle. It's something like a rampart that nearly every scholar of labor exploitation in the non-Western world must climb. And this barrier is formidable. It signals a kind of predetermined incommensurability between the labor system I describe and slavery, in quotes, which is invariably posited as a fixed, unproblematic, and clearly definable historical category. So what makes revisiting this issue today, for all of you at ASU, fun for me is that the tide has turned. In 2013, this felt like a very lonely effort, but no longer. In the last 5 or 6 years, similarly frustrated scholars have produced new critical work on non-Western and non-plantation slavery, established a journal in 2016, the Journal of Global Slavery, and made a strong mark and made a strong mark on the 2021 volume of the Cambridge World History of Slavery, Volume 2, which covers the period between 500 and 1420 CE. So a new conversation about comparative slavery is fast developing amongst these scholars, and I guess I am one. There is an emerging consensus, both critical of the dominant comparative frameworks and in search of new approaches to the historical study of slavery. So instead of being defensive, I feel kind of sort of triumphal, though I'm going to leave that ultimate evaluation to you, the audience. But since much of this research that is inspiring me right now is from European scholars or is only very recently published, I hope that it's useful and interesting to you to hear a brief synopsis of this work, especially the ways that it critically engages with two pillars of slave studies: Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death, published in 1982, and Moses Finley's Slavery and Modern Ideology, which was published in 1980. The 2013-ish version of this talk would have begun with a discussion of the scholars' work who influenced me at that time, and the ways that they conceptualized global comparative slavery. So Indrani Chatterjee and Richard Eaton's effort to recover slavery's history in South Asia, Catherine Cameron, an archaeologist pioneering the study of slave systems in prehistory, and Gwyn Campbell, who is spearheading the comparative study of slavery in the Indian Ocean world. Of particular importance to my early thinking was Indrani Chatterjee's somewhat polemical assertion that scholarship of Atlantic slavery had established a hegemonic and Eurocentric definition of slavery, which, like terms like modernity and civilization, are conceptually married to the events of Western history. This Eurocentric definition of slavery, Chatterjee argues, compels scholars to treat non-Western forms of unfree labor as some other thing. By defining these highly subjugated peoples outside of the Atlantic as not slaves, right, Chatterjee argues their historical experiences are damned to a kind of double silence. The first because they are highly subjugated people, so they are historical subalterns, mostly absent from the historical records already. The second silence is because their status as not slaves casts them outside of the zone of scholarly interest. There are no rich comparative studies of servants, subordinated clients or dependents, no audiences for such studies, and no theories to draw on. My 2013 argument drawing from Chatterjee was that non-Western, non-Atlantic, or let's just say Southeast Asian forms of slavery suffer an epistemological invisibility. We do not see them and do not study them, not because they were unimportant to history, but because they have been defined out of existence. Their visibility and importance will return only if and when we widen our scholarly definition of slavery. Richard Eaton, Chatterjee's co-editor, argued that American plantation slavery should be considered one well-known model of slavery, while South Asian models can work to expand the conceptual range of slavery as a category of historical study, with an eventual goal of placing all varieties of slavery into broader frameworks of comparative or world history. Drawing on Eaton and others, I argued for the need to pluralize the history of slavery and to recognize the existence of many slaveries in world history. So let's close the book on my 2013 thinking and jump to 2016 and the launch of the Journal of Global Slavery, in which the editor, Damian Allen Pargas, announced that slavery must be seen as one of history's most global and globalizing phenomena. The next year saw the opening of the Bond Center for Slavery and Dependency Studies, which has become an engine of new scholarship. Standing in 2021, this seems like a fine place to locate the birth of new global comparative slavery. The scholarship produced after 2016 shares a handful of seminal texts and arguments, and I'm going to just do my best to describe them in brief. The most important and widely cited is Joseph Miller's 2012 monograph, The Problem of Slavery as History, a Global Approach. Miller's influence extends from his critical examination of what he describes as structural and sociological definitions of slavery, which he convincingly argues are static and therefore anti-historical. Miller is aiming squarely at Orlando Patterson's magisterial Slavery and Social Death, though his criticism applies equally to the influential Marxist structuralism of Claude Melis's 1986 Anthropology of Slavery. Patterson defines slavery as a form of domination in which the master has total domination over a powerless slave, in which the condition of the slave is one of natal alienation, a kind of living death in which the slave exists outside of the society. Miller's trenchant observation is that Patterson's structuralist definition, and really any fixed definition of slavery, detaches slavery from historical study. It functionally dehistoricizes slavery. At historical moments when a state or a region's form of labor exploitation matches Patterson's definition, slavery exists. When practices change, slavery ceases to exist. To write history using a fixed definition of this or that social practice is to write the story of a historical subject that blinks in and out of existence, like a broken Christmas light. Miller argues for treating slavery, in his words, as a strategy, employed by elite actors to achieve highly varying and sometimes competing economic, political, and social cultural goals. Slavery is responsible to economic and political change, historical events, and to all other forms of contingency. It changes form. It changes forms. It is put to new uses. The treatment of slaves might alter over time as they are put to different uses or as ethical frameworks for the treatment of other human beings change, etc. Miller also reinforces Chatterjee's observation that forms of slavery that do not align with prevailing sociological definitions are always analyzed for their absences, analyzed for what they lack in comparison to the dominant framework of slavery, rather than for what they are. This aspect of Miller's argument was hallelujah'd and amplified in another core text, Kostas Vlasopoulos' article in the first issue of the Journal of Global Slavery, Does Slavery Have a History? He argues that slavery does not have an essence. There is enormous diversity among the ways that human beings as property have been used across time and in different cultural settings. The history of slavery, he argues, can be written when it's examined through its instrumentality. What is it being used to achieve? And how do these goals change over time? Like Miller, he is arguing that slavery must be historicized rather than abstracted. And so I kind of hope that this example might magnify what I'm saying, but you could imagine if we used a, say, sociologically fixed definition of gender categories. So decided that we could agree on what is male and what is female. And as we look then across different societies where those patterns didn't exist and started to write a history of gender, we would be describing time periods in which men disappeared or women disappeared and then reappeared again, whether or not they met this definition, rather than understanding slavery like we do gender to be mobile categories, right? That behave differently in different cultural contexts and then are contingent upon historical events so that they change and adapt they relate differently to each other over time. The 2018 volume, What is a Slave Society? The Practice of Slavery in Global Perspectives, offers a trenchant re-examination of Moses Finley's Slavery and Modern Ideology. Finley, in a sense, canonized the concept of the slave society, which he defined as societies dependent on the slave mode of production. Finley, too, is presenting a structuralist model, though his is economistic, because slaves were fundamental to the production of economic surplus. In a slave society, slavery fundamentally shapes, he argues, social, cultural, political, the foundations of the society. The necessary conditions for a slave society, by Finley's definition, is private ownership of land and a continuous demand, private ownership of land, an economy based on the production of commodities for sale in a market, and a continuous demand for labor force that cannot be met internally, and so must be acquired or captured from outside the society. Slave societies should be the locus of research on slavery, and Finley asserted that there were just 5 in history: Greece in the 5th century, Rome in the 1st century, and 19th century Brazil, the Caribbean, and the US South. The Eurocentric bias implicit in this list of 5 societies is stark, of course, and Finley acknowledges the existence of slavery in a great many societies. These he defined as societies with slaves, and this kind of slavery he described as ubiquitous, but not impactful. According to Finley, because their slaving practices did not dominate the economy, and therefore it was not embedded in the cultural and political firmaments of the society. As many of the scholars in What is a Slave Society ably point out, Finley's economic structuralism does not bear much scrutiny. It is possible for societies to have large numbers of slaves whose economic roles as producers of value commodities was minimal, but whose cultural and social impact was large, and that could describe Southeast Asia. As it is possible for society to have numerically few slaves, but whose roles are critical to political, cultural, and social processes. Finley's economic model for measuring the relative importance or non-importance of slavery was always deeply flawed, and his model, premised on private property and commodity production for markets, eliminates non-Western societies and time periods in which these 2 economic practices were largely absent. So the indirect effect of Finley's argument is to mark slavery outside the West as fugitive and uninteresting. Another instance of what I've already described as epistemological invisibility of non-Western forms of slavery, the peculiar way that slaves outside the West have been defined out of existence. So this takes me, I'm sorry, this slide is wrong, but anyway, this takes me to the final text that I want to discuss as part of my longish preamble, and I'm sorry for that. The just published 2nd volume of the Cambridge World History of Slavery, which covers the period 500 CE to 1420 CE. Not coincidentally, this volume addresses the black hole era in Finley's typology, the era between the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Atlantic plantation system. The volume's editors assert that, to the best of their knowledge, every known society in this era had slaves. Yet the study of slavery in this era is remarkably scarce, a factor that I am certain cannot be separated from the structural, ahistorical, and Eurocentric definitions that have unfortunately become fundamental to the academic study of slavery. To make this point, the editors of the Cambridge History examined bibliographic data gathered by the Journal of Slavery and Abolition, which has compiled a near complete list of English language academic publications going back to 1900. The results are genuinely surprising. Over the course of the 20th century, only 5% of the historical study of slavery was devoted to the era between 500 and 1400 CE, which means, of course, that 95% of slavery was devoted to classical or Atlantic slavery, or 95% of studies were devoted to classical or Atlantic slavery. Moreover, In that same 100-year period, 95% of the publications on slavery were geographically focused on what I would describe as Euro-American slavery, specifically Greece, Rome, and the Atlantic. Only 4% of scholarly attention was devoted to all of Asia, the Indian Ocean world, the Pacific, or the indigenous non-plantation slavery of the Americas. The last decade has witnessed a surge of scholarly interest in non-Western slave systems and world historical approaches to the study of slavery. Yet, as a percentage of total research on slavery, this surge does not even register as a blip. So between 2007 and 2016, the number of titles devoted to slavery in all non-Western societies held steady at a paltry 4% of total publications. So I read this as empirical evidence of my assertion of non-Western slavery suffering epistemological invisibility. So now I'd like to transition to my own work and rehydrate just for a second. So I recognize that my discussion of this new research is likely too short to be fully satisfying, but its appearance between the time that I wrote my dissertation and the time now that I've been preparing it for publication, so over the last 18 months, has been really exciting for me. My book is currently under review with Cambridge University. So to situate my own work in this emerging field, I also look at mainland Southeast Asia through the lens of strategy or instrumentality. But in this case, I recognize that slaves were employed in the production of cultural power, used by monarchs to symbolize the cosmopolitan and world-spanning character of their kingly power. What I think other scholars of global comparative slavery find interesting about my work is that I am expanding the concept of productivity in a way that harnesses Goetz's notion of the theater state, or the ways that Southeast Asian kings used public spectacle to manifest real power. But I prefer to use Bourdieu's term cultural capital because of the interesting ways that we can see slavery being used to produce power, capital, the capital of power, through their use as artisans and as public performers and as representatives of state power. So my research seeks to uncover processes of cultural exchange that are embedded in the history of long-distance slavery. And to this end, I have turned to studies of transcultural exchange in the Americas for inspiration, treating these admittedly divergent systems of slavery as ultimately comparable in several important ways. The greatest inspiration to my work comes from Crealization Theory. Crealization Theory is a conceptual framework first promoted by Francophone Caribbean intellectuals as a tool for locating the agency and cultural potency of Atlantic slave communities. So Crealization Theory posits that the experience of slavery, violent capture, being uprooted, being transported to a distant land, the destruction of old social bonds, and the creation of new ones, had profound transcultural implications. The process of rerouting oneself in a foreign land catalyzes cultural reinvention that necessarily draws from the dominant culture of the slaveholders and from the culture of captive communities. These newly created hybrid cultural and artistic forms have the potential to travel from slaves to non-slave communities, transforming the culture at large. The creolization model is one of complex dialogical exchange in which enslavement culturally transforms enslaved people, who in turn transform the culture of their captors. My own work harnesses creolization theory, subaltern studies, and calls like Antoinette Burton's recent move to write world history from below, because it allows us to see slaves as potent agents for creative invention and transculturation, with the power and ability to generate history-changing cultural and artistic practices. Creolization theory also comes with a research toolbox of sorts. It posits that generative creativity is most easily located in the areas of cultural life where slaves had a level of autonomy vis-a-vis their owners. Thus, it is most apparent in kinds of performance and artistic activities, religious practice and belief, song, music, dance, and poetry, foodways, and sometimes dress and even architecture. This insight informed my own research on war slaves in Burma, in which I looked across those same sets of practices to locate historical and culturally transformations within the context of slavery. So Edward Glissant, a pioneering theorist of creolization, cautions that creolization's complex processes of exchange produce unpredictable results. To this end, I've chosen a tiny piece of my research because it is highly visual, which I hope will be interesting to an audience that may or may not be familiar with Southeast Asian culture, and because it follows a specific cultural transformation that reverberates in truly unexpected ways. So I'm going to discuss a dance and music tradition introduced into Burma by enslaved artisans captured from Thailand. These traditions had a strong effect on theatrical dance and music in Burma, which is something we might expect. But its influence grew to affect a wide variety of royally sponsored arts, then religious painting, and eventually it transformed the ways that Burmese people imagined both gods and monsters. So before I begin this history, let me describe the context of royal slavery in Southeast Asia. Slave-gathering warfare was an endemic feature of the region's statecraft in the pre-colonial era. In lightly populated Southeast Asia, interstate warfare centered on the capture of people and not land. Siege warfare was often ended in the enslavement of rival populations who were marched back to the victor's homeland and resettled. War captives were frequently valued for the skills that they already possessed. So painters, dancers, silversmiths, elephant veterinarians, soldiers, and silk weavers were settled in work groups, owned and controlled by the king, and tasked with jobs very similar to the ones that they had in their homeland. Unskilled workers might find themselves doing drudge work, digging canals, building roads, and rowing royal galleys. But being a skilled slave owned by the king held status in Southeast Asian society, a status that could be higher than an unskilled or free commoner. Moreover, kings in Southeast Asia expressed their power through artistic projects that announced the universality or world-embracing character of their rule. Foreign arts and foreign cultural practices were self-consciously incorporated into royal projects. For this reason, the creolization process in this part of the world must be distinguished from creolization in the Atlantic, because at times, elite actors participated in projects to hybridize and adopt aspects of culture introduced by enslaved communities. So this map represents the rapid expansion of the Burmese Empire after 1750 and the distance its slave-gathering armies ventured from its capital area in Upper Burma. Burmese expansion had domino-like repercussions as conquered and depopulated kingdoms in turn rebuilt their population base by conducting still more slave raids against weaker rivals. The eventual result of Burmese expansionism was a profound reshuffling of the mainland's population in the 18th and early 19th century. And my research covers this entire time frame and many of these conquered peoples, but today we're focusing on just Ayutthaya, the capital of Thailand, so you can kind of see it in the bottom of the picture if you're not familiar with the Southeast Asian map, from which the Burmese conquered and carried away somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 captives in 1767. So amongst these captives were Thai royal dancers and musicians that specialized in performing a masked dance version of the Ramayana. These captives were incorporated into the Burmese palace, and they were charged with palace entertainment. Their influence on Burmese culture has led to the creation of what I've called the Creole Ramayana. It's called a masked dance tradition because dancers performed in elaborate masks, some of which are represented here in the slide. The Ramayana, for those of you who may not know, is central to understanding the civilizations of both India and Southeast Asia. The text is foundational. It's religious and ethical and exciting. It is the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Old Testament, and the first Star Wars trilogy kind of all rolled into one. And it fills that kind of social space. Its episodic stories are incorporated into sermons, bedtime stories, religious festivals, and rural fairs. It is not so, in the not so distant past, it was a universal feature of daily life. It shaped the Southeast Asian worldview. Therefore, changes made to the Ramayana can inspire corresponding changes to the way people interpret and imagine the world around them. To brutally foreshorten the story, it is about a hero prince named Rama, always green-faced in Southeast Asian presentation, and his royal brother Lakshmana, always in gold, so they're here on this slide, who undertake an episodic adventure to rescue Rama's beautiful wife, Sita, whose face is white, from Ravana, the 10-headed ogre king, also shown here. Ravana spirited Sita away to his ogre kingdom in Sri Lanka, and Rama is joined in his quest by a loyal monkey general, Hanuman, white-faced, and his army of monkey soldiers. After many adventures, Rama and the monkey army defeat Ravana and his ogre army, and the two lovers are reunited. Both Burma and Thailand could be said to love the Ramayana story equally, but in Burma, the story was celebrated through song and poetry, so non-visually. There were no visual representations. In Thailand, it developed into a theatrical spectacle with dance, the colorful masks I've shown here, bejeweled costumes, and song. To understand the effect of the Thai Ramayana dance drama on Burmese culture, we might think of the way that the movie version of a book, even a beloved book, has the effect of erasing our imagination of characters and places and replacing them with the potent visuality of the film. So, I mean, think about James Bond or Harry Potter. How did you imagine them before you saw the movie? Can you even reimagine them now? The Thai Ramayana play was similar. It was a vessel carrying a complex and highly symbolic visual language that attached to an already well-known story in Burmese culture. So I'd like to show you two clips of the Thai Ramayana to just familiarize you with the visual language. In this first film, we see the Ogre King Ravana dancing, and just notice that the dance is highly gestural, that particular body poses hold specific meaning or represent specific words. These elegant poses became inspirational to many Burmese artists. So this second film demonstrates a beloved feature of Thai dance: acrobatic battle scenes, in which balancing up on another character's head and shoulders represents dominance in combat. And as I'll show you in just a few minutes, these acrobatic feats had a deep effect on the Burmese wood carving tradition and other artistic traditions in Burma. Okay. The masks themselves are important to the visual language in the Thai Ramayana, and I'd like you to recognize the colors and elaborations on masks. The steep-sided and gilded crowns are an important feature of the color coding of the different characters. But for our purposes today, I just want to draw attention to the representation of ogres, the savage enemies of Rama and his monkey army. In Thai art, ogres are represented with crocodile-like features: green shiny skin, protruding teeth, and crocodilian eyes and brows. Ramayana dance costumes have remained relatively constant over the last 300 or so years. Scholars speculate that the exaggerated epaulettes, the tight-fitting upper body costume, and the stiffly brocaded flaps that are on the lower body represent ancient armor. And remember these exaggerated costume features because they'll also be important over the next few minutes. More interesting within Thai art is the appearance of Ramayana-style characters in Thai Buddhist religious art. For example, ogres appear in several of the 550 legends about the past lives of the Buddha, which I'm going to call Jataka tales here. They are invariably represented with crocodile faces, steep crowns, and dancers' costumes. The example here is from a mid-18th century Thai manuscript of the Vitura Jataka. In this story, which I will summarize because it's going to come up a few times, an ogre assassin named Punaka is mistakenly dispatched to kill a past life incarnation of the Buddha, a sage named Vidura. Punaka the ogre tries to terrify the sage by attaching him to a magical horse and flying him high up into the sky. So this particular manuscript is not in great condition because of its age, but I think you can see in the bottom right corner the representation of the sage Punaka being hauled up into the sky by the magic horse. But when Punaka recognizes that the sage is divinely unperturbed, he realizes that there is something truly special about him and agrees to listen to him preach the Buddhist gospel. The ogre converts on the spot, represented in this picture by his deep and reverent Y, a gesture demonstrating his newfound devotion to Buddhist philosophy. And that's represented in the bottom left corner. And then I've blown the picture up because it's a little bit unclear so that you can see it in the lower circular form on the slide. And as you can see, the ogre Punaka is represented in a crown and a costume of an ogre as they are presented in the Ramayana dance drama. So, here is another religious story from the life of the historical Buddha, which is represented in wall paintings at almost every temple in Thailand. In this scene, Siddhartha, the prince that will become the Buddha, renounces his wealth and power and is leaving his palace to great supernatural fanfare to become an ascetic in search of enlightenment. The evil god Mara, opponent of the Buddha and promoter of chaos and suffering, has a premonition of how this will end and feels threatened by the coming of Buddhist doctrine. Mara appears to halt the prince's progress and send him back to the palace. His dress and costume mirror the Ramayana ogre, and the pose is dancerly. So let's shift gears now and look at the establishment of the Thai Ramayana dance drama in Burma. Shortly following the mass deportation of war captives from Thailand, a performance troupe of captured Thai dancers and musicians was established in the Burmese palace. The Ramayana dance drama gained popularity among the Burmese elite, rising to become a common evening entertainment. So this is a Burmese manuscript painting of temple entertainment, and you can see the Ramayana being danced under the stage, which looks like an umbrella, and the king and queen are in the pavilion that's just to the left. It invariably became a showcase art form. European delegations to Burma were treated to performances of the play. Its popularity continued, and 91 descendants of these Thai war slaves were still at work in the palace when the British colonized Upper Burma in 1885. So nearly 120 years after this dance form was introduced to Burma. The visual language of the Ramayana eventually spread out from the palace. A key date in this history is 1789, when the palace initiated a translation project that reinterpreted the Ramayana songs and poetry from Thai language into Burmese. The Burmese commoners would grow to love the play and songs over the course of the 19th century, a development that was no doubt facilitated by this translation project. In Burma, royal power was demonstrated through grand public spectacles, such as royal parades that could stretch for miles. These events were often recorded in illustrated books. The book pictured here unfolds to a length of 30 feet, And skilled foreign captives, symbolizing royal power and prestige, were incorporated into these parades. So here in this manuscript, we see Thai dancers and musicians performing on display in a parade. And for Burmese readers, this particular manuscript is labeled. So it says Yodia Ati for the band here, and Yodia Aka representing the dancers below. So here we see a second example of this same kind of document. These parades also introduce the Thai visual language to the Burmese public. So please take note of the way that dancers on display wear their performance masks on top of their head, because this again will come up at the very end of my talk. So far what we're seeing is something that we might expect. A dance and music tradition of foreign slaves deeply affecting the dance and music traditions of their captors. However, the scholar U Tse Myint has shown that by the 19th century, scenes and characters from the Thai-style Ramayana had risen to become, by far, the most popular motif in sacred, royal, and decorative arts traditions in Burma. We can think of this as the first example of an unexpected or unpredictable change wrought by Thai-Burmese creolization, or perhaps as the way that this new visual language sent ripples into other aspects of the cultural imagination. So here we see silver work, glazed ware, and pottery. Here are a few more examples to give you a sense of the scope in lacquerware, stucco work, wood carving, and glass mosaics. Burma also has a unique tradition of embroidered wall hangings. So here is one that's narrating a scene from the Ramayana. And I asked you earlier to remember the acrobatic combat presented in the Thai version of the Ramayana performance. These scenes became a peculiar obsession of Burma's famous wood carvers, who thrilled to the aesthetic challenge of representing Ramayana-style combat on Buddhist temple walls. I could show you dozens more examples of this because they are all over the surviving temples from this period, but I think this will suffice. A second transformation of Burmese artistic culture is again somewhat more unexpected. I will show you that Ramayana representations steadily transform the way that the Burmese imagined and represented subhuman monsters and evil gods. As I mentioned earlier, in Thai art and the imagination, subhuman, monstrous, and evil creatures derive their characteristics from river crocodiles. Their unsettling green skin, eyes, brows, and fang-like teeth come from that fearsome animal. The Burmese artistic imagination draws on apes and monkeys in their representation of evil beings. Evil and fearsome creatures have simian qualities, hairy bodies, necklace heads that seem to emerge from their torso. Their teeth can be seen as protruding from lipless mouths. The style was flexible and unfixed, but these qualities were common in most representations of creatures like ogres, Mara, the evil god who opposed the Buddha. And seen here are various cave temple paintings of Mara and ogres dating to the period before the Thai-style Ramayana arrived in Burma. So, we can find some fun examples of experimentation in the representation of ogres after the visual language of the Ramayana takes hold in Burma. So here is a hairy ape-like creature, but squeezed into a Thai-style dancing costume. We can also see this change clearly in looking at two representations of the same religious story. So remember the story I recounted earlier about Punaka, the ogre assassin, and the magical flying horse. Here is a representation of that story in Burmese art before Thai influence. And here is that same story after the Thai-style Ramayana has grown in popularity. Punaka's skin is not green, but all the other characteristics match the play's representation of an ogre dancer: the epaulets, the crown, and the facial features. We can also see that the evil god Mara is reimagined. This image is from one of the best preserved illustrated histories of the Buddha, acquired by the British Museum in 1837. Earlier, I described this scene in the Thai context. It illustrates the evil god Mara attempting to halt Siddhartha's progress from the palace. This Burmese representation of Mara could be a Xerox copy of the Thai example that I showed you earlier. As we can see clearly in this next slide, although they are separated by almost 100 years, the Thai and Burmese representations of Mara have become almost identical. Both draw inspiration from the Ramayana Ogre, and both are starkly different from Burmese illustrations of Mara from before Thai influence. A third and truly unpredictable change is the use of the mask as a symbol of conversion and Buddhist goodness. In Thailand, the mask of an ogre is a representation of how real ogres appear in the wild. In Burma, by contrast, the cultural imagination of an ogre derived from the masks that were introduced by enslaved Thai artisans. And in the last half of the 19th century, we can see Burmese artists representing ogres as masked people. The maskiness of the Burmese ogre leads to uses of visual symbolism unseen and unimaginable in Thailand. So here again is the story of Punaka, the ogre assassin, this time in a temple wood carving. Punaka is represented as a man in a mask, which is important because after hearing the Dharma talk of the great sage, his moment of conversion is symbolized by the rising of his ogre mask, representing a transformational change to his consciousness and the emergence of a Buddhist humanity from within. This is a pure example of crealization, a new cultural practice born from the collision of two cultures in the context of slavery. But finally, this mask metaphor unexpectedly and unpredictably spread much farther, affecting the representation of tutelary spirits worshipped in the Burmese countryside. Many Burmese villagers worship pre-Buddhist deities called flower-eating ogres, or ogres that have converted to Buddhism and in doing so have switched from cannibalizing unfortunate humans to a strictly vegetarian diet. The spirit of these potent ogres can be called upon in times of need, and here are pictures of the flower-eating ogre Popa Maidaw, as she is represented in various spirit shrines that I've visited. And here is another famous image of the good ogre Sandamukhi, who protects the city of Mandalay. The Thai-style ogre mask sits atop her head in a way that is identical to the captive Thai dancers that paraded beside the Burmese king in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Ramayana visuality stimulated widespread developments in the Burmese art, but this one is, I think, truly fantastic. The dancer's mask has taken on a symbolic meaning. It demonstrates that conversion to Buddhism can uncover an enlightened humanity in even the most monstrous among us, which is maybe a good point for us to consider as I draw this discussion to a close. It reveals to us the potent agency of historical subjects who suffered what I have described as an epistemological invisibility, falling through the historical cracks. This one dance form sent ripples of change through each and every major Burmese artistic practice. It even rippled into religious belief and representation. We can say that it transformed the very way that everyday Burmese people imagined both gods and monsters. This is all from a community of war captives, almost entirely absent from the historical record, but for the artistic evidence that they have left behind for us to try and read. Thank you.
A broad-ranging conversation you invited us in. We really appreciate that.
Sure. If there's, I've kept a time, right?
Yes,
Julian?
absolutely, and it's been fascinating.
Okay. I have a bonus. I have like a 1-minute bonus I could
yes.
show.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. If I kept the time, I thought I would show this just because it's another kind of funny historical development. So this is a kind of practice that spread through the Burmese due to the Burmese invasions and slave gathering raids into Manipur, which is a little state. It's you can see that it's colored in red on the map here, so many people would be unfamiliar with it. It's in northeast India, a mountain kingdom, which was famous for its horsemanship and its cavalry training practices. And so, as Burma invaded Manipur, the most devastating invasion being beginning in 1819. The kingdom was destabilized. Much of the standing army was captured by the Burmese, but other squadrons of the cavalry were able to kind of flee into northeast India, ending up taking refuge amongst the British in what would become the tea-growing areas of Assam. And because these cavalry soldiers were so well respected in the Burmese context, they were allowed to wear their kind of very colorful, bright military costume. So even though they were incorporated into the Burmese military, they maintained their Manipuri dress. And this was something that was represented by the British in many paintings. So the Burmese cavalry soldier, is represented in green here with a golden hat. Behind him is a Manipuri cavalryman in the Burmese military. But what is interesting here is the training practice of the Manipuri cavalry. They practice a game, to master their horsemanship, they used a mallet to hit a ball around an open field, a game that they called puli. And the refugees that were driven by war into British areas ended up passing this game on to British soldiers. So this is a photo right here of John F. Shearer, who's considered the father of polo, the person that would introduce it to the British. And here he is with the Manipuri polo instructors who taught him the game. Eventually, these refugee soldiers were gathered into teams and sent into Calcutta, where they would play British soldiers. It is from this invasion that polo was globalized around the world. As soldiers transferred out of India to other colonial outposts, they took the game with them. But simultaneously, this game went to Burma, where it became popular within the palace. So here's an image of polo having been taught now by the Manipuris to the Burmese cavalry, being played in the palace to entertain the king and queen. So an interesting sort of an unexpected trivia, I guess, is what I'd like to leave you with in this last minute. Okay, thank you. That's the real end of my talk now.
Well, from here, we'll go to the Q&A. I'm sure there are a lot of questions for Professor Beemer and the wonderful talk. This is always a little bit complicated on the webinar. There is a Q&A forum. If you want to post your questions there, I can act as a medium and read them to the group. Or if you'd like to raise your digital hand, we should be able to unmute you and you can ask directly. So either the Q&A forum, or if you'd like to raise your hand via the Zoom function, we will somehow get your question out.
And did I successfully close the presentation so that you see me now?
We see you now, yes.
Okay, great.
Questions, hands? I see, okay, great. We have a question from Professor Hannah Barker, who's in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and who is a scholar of slavery in the in the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. Professor Barker, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you to talk more about the use of slaves as cultural capital. So this is something that I'm familiar with more in the medieval Islamic world. So I'm curious, you have slave dancers. What other kinds of functions are slaves performing, especially in this sort of public ceremonial display kind of and theatrical display kind of a context?
Okay. In the Burmese case, so I do want to, I didn't make this part of my talk, but I mean, I do want to stress that slaves were divided according to their skills, and it was very possible to become a very low status, no status slave within the Burmese system. But if we're going to look at people that become cultural capital, I think the most prominent group that I didn't describe here are court Brahmins. Buddhist palaces require Brahmanical ritual in order to both in order to sort of ceremonially and ritualize royal power. So Brahmins oversee tantra ceremonies, the crowning ceremonies, foot washing, all of the things that kind of instantiate royal power through religious and symbolic acts. And what is truly fascinating about Burma is that all of the Brahmins are war captives. A great many were captured from Manipur, and others were captured from Arakan. So the fact that royal power is actually dependent on these ceremonies. Some of them are private and some of them are quite public, but the Brahmins were also paraded and parading with the king when the king went out, and some of these ceremonies were done in public. The other, symbolic act that I think is very important is that these were Southeast Asian power was demonstrated through objects that represented the rank of the hierarchy within the palace. So sumptuary objects. And sumptuary objects were manufactured within this labor system that was owned by the king. So, and sumptuary objects changed over time when war captives were introduced into these groups. So, particularly silver working is transformed by the arrival of Thai captives. Gold work and silk weaving are transformed when Manipuri artisans were incorporated into those particular work groups. So this symbolic potency of sumptuary objects too is highly influenced by captured people. Do you want to follow up, or did that answer your question?
That answered my question. I'm really interested in the sumptuary objects, but I'll maybe email you about that later.
Okay, I'd love to get it. Thank you.
We have a question from Professor Jim Rush, who is also a historian focusing on Southeast Asia. Professor Rush, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, good. Hi, well, thanks for the great talk. So I'm interested in these Thai captives. They became the slaves in the palace, I take it, the slaves of the king, of the monarch. What do you know about what happens to them and their families downstream? I wonder whether some of them, perhaps the women, might be brought into royal concubines or even marry members of the aristocracy, given their life in and around the palace. And if so, what of their children? So from one generation to the next, how does their status as slaves change?
Right. So I might have very meticulously avoided in my own work deciding whether or not captured princes and princesses and monarchs count as slaves, even though they're sort of situated in the palace and highly policed. But yeah, to answer your question, one of the most interesting parts of my research project was to find descendants of war captives who remembered this history. Just because Southeast Asian historians, I think it's a heuristic argument, but I think it's long been assumed that over time, almost all war captives assimilate. But what I found is that there are many who do not, and they all share certain common features. One is whether or not they have whether or not they practice a minority religion, because this ends up reinforcing their alterity. So Brahmins the Brahmin communities of war captives continue to exist into the present day. There are big Brahmin communities in and around the Mandalay area. And of course, these are groups of people who will intermarry, right, to preserve their caste status. And so Brahmin war captives from Manipur and from Arakan are prevalent today, as are Muslim war captives. Muslim war captives from Arakan and from Manipur too tended to intermarry and to have a distinguishing feature about them that reinforces their alterity. But the second feature, and it relates actually back to Hannah Barker's question, which is that slaves were exploited for what we could call positive stereotypes, right? Thais were considered to be excellent dancers. Manipuri women were considered to be excellent silk weavers. And this stereotype then kind of carries market benefits that continue after the fall of the monarchy. So Manipuri silk weavers are still an ethnic category that exists in Upper Burma, as were Thai dancers. The Thai dancing quarter lasted up until the 1940s or 1950s, and when it burned down due to the fighting between the British and the Japanese that burned much of Mandalay, that community didn't reconstitute itself afterwards. But Thai dancers maintained a kind of salience and potency as a community, and so they maintain this identity. So we could think of it as being a kind of market benefit to certain identities. But if I go out into the rural areas where Thais were settled as farmers, say rice farmers, or Manipuris also, here you find that the identity has faded away. There's no force to kind of maintain alterity. So I kind of name this process elective alterity, people choosing to continue a memory of their outsiderness. And it's always connected to religion or whether or not there's a kind of positive benefit. And then, of course, with Brahmins, it's both simultaneously. Brahmins continue to do ritual practices for their Burmese neighbors today, so their outsiderness has a market salience, but also then their religious practice separates them. So in terms of the royal captives, yes, Thai princesses, if the number of Thai princesses captured from Ayutthaya was counted, so it's in the record, and I forget what the number is, but they pretty meticulous, and many were incorporated, into the palace as, sexual partners of the king. Princes were settled in a suburb that retains the name Prince's Quarter in Mandalay, and were brought into the palace for palace activities. So some of them rose to prominence and had some political power, especially ex-king Utampan, the Thai king. It's a little bit of a long story, but the brother of the king who was in power when Ayutthaya fell was found in fetters, like he was found locked up in the prison, and he had been the previous king of Ayutthaya, and he was captured and entered the monkhood in Burma. And there's lots of oral history about him organizing the Thai community, starting celebrations, encouraging certain productive acts amongst artisans, and this kind of activity. I feel like I've only danced around the direct question, though. Do you want to refocus me?
Yes.
Okay.
So that's fascinating. So thank you for all of that. And so for some groups, at least, the alterity remains. So my question has to do with, at what point were these people no longer slaves?
So I think there becomes, I think as long as the palace controls them and is exploiting their labor, so asking for the delivery of so many pounds of carved silver work, or so many dress lengths of silk, then they are slaves, as far as I'm concerned, though I understand that this is problematic. And one of the interesting things about the state control in Burma, something that you don't see in Thailand, is that the marriage practices of artisans were controlled, which also sustained the community. So if a silk weavers were encouraged to intermarry, there was a notion of how many silk weavers the kingdom needed in order to meet the minimum standard of sumptuary objects that had to be delivered to the palace. And so people weren't allowed to outmarry from this group or leave the group without permission. If a silk weaver ended up marrying, say, a silversmith, this actually became a court decision, and it would be decided often. You can find these court rulings in which sons of that marriage have to go into silversmithing, whereas daughters will have to go into silk weaving. And sometimes these marriages were refused outright because there was a need to protect the labor group. So there is a state control over these groups. And so I just continue to treat them or to think of them as enslaved people until the end of the monarchy.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Good question. This might be extremely tangential, and I've asked from near total ignorance. As a non-historian who looks at translation, at one point you mentioned the 1789 translation of the Ramayana from Thai to Burmese. I would imagine this had to be a fairly epic project. And I'm wondering, broadly speaking, can you talk a little bit more about the project in general and how this act of linguistic translation maybe is situated within this larger process of, an incorporation of artistic motifs or dance, or, it almost seems like there's multiple kinds of translation occurring in terms of, figural, artistic, but also how this linguistic project fits in there. I'm just curious about this translation from Thai to Burmese.
Yeah, so there has been in Burmese, there's been some one really excellent book that has studied this process, making note of the fact that because of the strong differences in the language, that this probably transformed the melody of these songs as they were translated, because the melody has to follow the line of the language. And so there would have been a period in which Thai music would have been performed in the palace like as it was and sung in Thai. And after 1789, these songs are then translated into Burmese. But that also would have required melodic changes. But more interesting still is that there were palace competitions between Burmese bands and Thai, let's call them ensembles, between Thai musical ensembles and Burmese musical ensembles. This was considered a kind of fun palace entertainment. And eventually a kind of clique of princes who were musically talented and court ministers created something that's called the Ayutthaya music, which is a blending of Thai and Burmese musical elements with the idea that by mixing the two together, these bands can compete on more equal footing. And this music now has risen to become a classical art form, so that every classical music student has to master 13 songs from this particular musical tradition, which is part of a kind of creolization process, but one too that has an elite hand in it, which makes it different from the Atlantic, as I described earlier. To go back just to the translation, though, it was a committee. The committee was particular royal figures that had developed a facility with Thai for having lived there or were known for their poetry, and they sat together with Thai performers who then recited lines to them, and they would sort of figure out how to translate it melodically into Thai. The original the first translation of the Ramayana is lost, but later translations, ones from 5 or 6 years later, like second stabs at it, are still extant, and some have been published, and you can look at them. The other really interesting one, though, is the Enau, which is fascinating because it's actually a Malay Muslim play that moved to Ayutthaya when Ayutthayan armies conquered Malays, and it brought a kind of Muslim-oriented story into the Thai palace where it was translated from Malay to Thai. That play then traveled to Burma, where it was translated from Thai into Burmese. It's perhaps a 400-page translation, and the original exists. And what's so interesting about the Burmese email is that it is set on islands in Indonesia, but it's using the transliteration of those island names from Malay into Thai and then Thai into Burmese. So there's this kind of really interesting scramble of the translation. But that's the one that exists from this particular community, like that is completely intact now.
Thank you. That was really fascinating.
So again, I feel like I danced around the,
No. That was
question a bit.
it was a
that gets
very,
there.
very broad question. Thank you.
Mhm.
We have one question from an attendee who wishes to remain anonymous. If I understand correctly, comparing the kind of oppression that is discussed, I think within kind of in discussions of Western slavery, how would that be represented within the example of the Ramayana? Or is that not something associated with Southeast Asian slavery?
Oh, wait, can we restate the question?
Sure.
Is it to find an analog? Is it to find an analog in Western slavery to the Ramayana, or?
That's how I'm understanding it.
Okay.
If somebody in the audience would like to clarify, please feel free.
Yeah.
That's how I'm understanding the question.
I think, let's see. There are direct analogs. I'm trying to figure out how to include the Ramayana as one, but instead what I'm going to do is jump over to one that I think is quite direct. And it forms the first chapter of my book. And it is about Sagaing, which is a town just outside of Mandalay, where a great many war captives from Manipur were settled. And Manipur had a religion that was, I think might best be described as a kind of animist pantheon of gods, local gods. Manipur didn't have a world religion. And what I found when I went to this area and started conducting research is that the villages there had what they called Kathay Nat, which is the ethnonym for Manipuris. Nat means local spirit. And they described carrying their gods with them from Manipur, or that the Manipuri gods followed them. And what went on in Manipur was this, or what went on amongst these Manipuris in Sagaing was a process by which they converted to Buddhism and turned their old gods from Manipur into local spirits. And this process, I think, mirrors the way we think about Catholicism in Haiti, and the way that African gods were, and the features of different African religious practices were transposed onto saints with this conversion to Catholicism. And we can see that there's a lot of really interesting ways that alterity is maintained through cult religious practices in rural areas that were very surprising to me, and also I think map quite easily to examples that we find amongst African slaves in the Americas. So I hope that sideways maneuver answers the question.
So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
It's asking you to engage the perspective perhaps from the court, looking towards all the different kinds of subjects that a king might rule over, and to speak perhaps for a minute to how slaves fit into that array of different kinds of members of different status classes.
Mm-hmm.
Just to illustrate for our non-Asianists, the array of status possibilities that a slave, it wasn't just as though there were there were slaves and free people. There were people who owed to different degrees. Yeah. So.
Right. Yeah. Okay. This is great. So I think the best way to understand Southeast Asian societies at this time is actually for their complete absence of something that we would call, meaningfully call free people. All people were obligated in some way to, or were obligated to the state for some form of production. So you have slaves who are under the direct control of the lord, the king, or the wealthy person that owned them. So one, that it's kind of obvious, but at the same time, there was another category of debt slaves. So people that owed money and moved into a kind of servitude that could last a short amount of time until they repaid it, but frequently lasted a lifetime, because with compounding interest, debt slavery could be something that you would never escape. The next category of people, so people who are not, let's say, owned either temporarily or permanently, still had large obligations to the state, often as Corvae laborers. So people could just be claimed by the state for 3 months of labor or more. People could be assigned to the military. No sector of the society outside of the very elite escaped, what you would call like unremunerated labor, owed to the state, or labor exploitation. No one escaped it, because everyone was obligated to provide it to someone else. And this is why this is one of the places where I would say that, what I described earlier as epistemological invisibility creeps in through the Southeast Asian area studies approach to the study of slavery, which is to point out that slaves can't be easily distinguished from other groups of people within the society. And so it's better to, in the past, what's been said, or still kind of a dominant idea in the field, is that it's better to understand everyone in the society as having different levels of obligation and dependency. This kind of invisibility, though, has made this processes that I've been talking about here invisible, because we fold war captives back into the society as whole as just another aspect of unfree workers. We don't recognize them for what is particular or special about them, which is their foreignness, and the way that that foreignness separates them, and the way that that foreignness could be exploited for labor purposes and then become transformative within the society. This is another place where I think the epistemological invisibility sets in. And that's also why I argue that, even without a category that we might call free, foreign captives become an important group to separate and to study. And just to put a pin on that, the other feature of this, I think, is that it is actually their inseparability that is part of their potency. Because the slaves were assimilated gradually into the society, and because slaves were kind of indistinguishable and mixed in, and because slaves were exploited, this difficulty in separating them as a distinct class actually magnifies their potency as an agentive force for cultural change in the society. It is that exact mixing into the labor system that is important.
That's a great point to make. It also seems to me that rituals like those royal parades that display the different kinds of ethnic groups that are indebted in different ways to the king or the palace. It's a great way of displaying royal power.
Right. Yeah.
Mr. Burker, did you want to add to that too? I see your hand is up.
Yeah, so I wanted to follow up on that question, that one of the issues in this sort of cross-cultural comparative study of slavery is about terminology, right? And the fact that a lot of this academic discourse is happening in English, but English is not exactly the most sophisticated language for talking about a range of unfree statuses.
Yes.
So you're sort of outlining for us, you have war captives who are foreign, who you're calling slaves, which I think makes sense. And then there's debt bondage, and then there's labor obligations. So to what extent is this a division that you're imposing as sort of an analytical division? And to what extent is there sort of a terminological distinction within the Burmese language between these different groups?
Right. So this has always been a kind of outstanding feature of scholarship on Southeast Asian slavery, is that the terms that are used indigenously, so in the case of Burma, June, in the case of Thailand, Tat, that this ends up being a word that covers a huge range of statuses. So it is a word that applies to our Brahmins, but it also applies to someone that is cleaning sewage from the city canal. And that range of statuses has always made people kind of uncomfortable to use it as a blanket term or to just translate as slave. This, I feel, is the thing that I think we should get away from, because if we break away from our kind of Western conception of what slave means, we can start to recognize that slaves could hold multiple statuses, and that the question that would be asked of a June in order to understand their status, and this was a point that was made by Michael Ong Thwin in an article that was published 20 years ago, the question would be, who do you work for and what do you do? Because then if you're in the employ of a prince, you hold status through that employment. And if you're a silver worker or an elephant veterinarian or a court Brahmin, you hold status through that as well. If you're kind of owned by the town sewage committee and you're in charge of clearing canals of waste, then your status is much lower. But all of these are categorized similarly within the system. So this word June, which ends up covering all captured people, but also local people who are assigned to these jobs, is different from the term that is for debt laborers, and then is different from the term pry or other terms which would kind of indicate peasant, but peasant with state obligations. So these are kind of the three ways that you could divide the society. Again, all of them with obligations to state labor. Maybe just to follow up on that too, which is just that, one of the kind of Eurocentric frameworks for understanding slavery is that slavery has to be opposed to a category that is free, right? For slavery to have meaning. And the implications of that, which are, kind of being raised in this new literature that I talked about at the beginning, is that in a peculiar way, what that means is there can't be slavery in a society that does not also have freedom, right? This is one of these sort of structural approaches to the study of slavery that ends up creating invisibilities, again, as I would describe them. And it ends up meaning that slavery can't exist in societies that are authoritarian or in which there's no legalistic or juridical category of free. And then that becomes problematic too to the study of slavery over time.
Definitely. Thank you. This is really interesting. And sorry, I have a barking dog in the background here too.
I didn't hear it, so don't worry about it.
Okay, that's good.
Professor Rush, do you have a follow-up question too?
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. So yes, this is fascinating. So now I'm interested in this question of enslaved people who have all different kinds of statuses, including some of them quite high statuses. So what do we know about their material lives? So I would imagine that high and low statuses implies that people of high status, even though they were enslaved in one way or another, might lead quite prosperous lives. Is this correct?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The nice thing about Burma is we have records of the way that communities of artisans were treated by the state, or were sort of, what would we call, sort of, yeah, exactly. So they're assigned communities, areas around the palace. The interesting thing about, well, this is true in Thailand as well, in all of Southeast Asia, the interesting way that palaces worked is that there was a cellular structure around the palace of the different laborers, right? And this old state structure is just imprinted on the modern city in Southeast Asia, so that, you know, if you're wandering around in Bangkok, you will go down Silversmith Lane and end up in Buddha bronze pouring court, and you can end up in, you know, and then a little bit further down from there is begging bowl pounding alley. And this is true too in Mandalay. As you circle around, there's the silk weavers quarter, and these are either in the local names for these areas, or actually have become street names or neighborhood names, you know, the old labor system. And these were areas that were given to workers to live in. And during the times when they had to produce, there was often an amount of rice that would have to be delivered to the workers as well, to cover their expenses. The king was interested in having his power displayed through the quality of life that these laborers had. And in a sense, as you wandered around the palace, you saw the production of sumptuary work being, the kind of sumptuary activities that the palace was commanding and demanding at that same time. So yes, these people lived material lives. And, you know, one of the things we say about Southeast Asian captives of princes and kings is that their material lives were better than commoners. Mm-hmm. And this is a feature not just in, you know, mainland Southeast Asia, but also island Southeast Asia as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we're coming up on an hour and a half. Maybe we should conclude things here and thank our speaker once more. Thank you very much, Professor Beemer, for a wonderful talk. We had a really great audience. Thank you for questions. Very much. We can invite you out here in person sometime soon. Thank you, everybody, for coming. The next event in the Global Asia series will be in January, so please keep an eye out for a notification about that. And again, thank you very much for a wonderful talk today. It's great to see you.
Thank you very much. And just to let you know, I yearn for the world in which you can invite me out.
We do too. We do too.
I hope that's coming soon.
It'll be here soon. It has to be. It has to be. Thank you very much.
All right.
Have a good morning.
Thank you.